Hey everyone, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we drift back to a specific, often unspoken corner of Victorian London, a world of hushed transactions and carefully constructed appearances. We'll attempt to understand the lived reality of a woman navigating one of the era's most condemned yet undeniably pervasive professions, that of a brothel worker. As you settle deeper into the quiet of this evening, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft like on the video. Only, of course, if these historical whispers find a welcome place in your thoughts, perhaps as the cold, fog-laden nights of old London once found their way into every crack and crevice. And feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're drifting from tonight. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let the rhythmic cadence of the past lull you into a state of calm. Imagine yourself stirring slowly from the embrace of a lumpy horsehair mattress in a small room at the back of a brothel in London's bustling Haymarket area. It's the year 1857, and the faint light filtering through a grimy window pane suggests the reluctant arrival of a new day. Your thin woolen blanket, though offering some meager comfort, has done little to ward off the persistent chill that permeates the very bones of the building. The sheets beneath you were last changed, perhaps 4 or 5 days ago. A small improvement on the weekly schedule, and they carry that peculiar, almost contradictory scent. A faint ghost of cheap lavender water stubbornly trying to mask the deeper, more pervasive mustiness of a room that serves many purposes for many people over many hours. No memory foam, no Egyptian cotton sheets here, just the stark, scratchy reality of a Victorian dawn. The cold in the room is not just a sensation, it's a palpable presence, a direct consequence of the strictly rationed coal that fuels the small fireplace downstairs. Even in the height of winter, the morning hours are reserved for a polite couple of degrees above freezing, a brisk reminder that warmth is a luxury, not a given. You pull the thin blanket closer, the coarse wool rasping softly against your cheek. Your gaze drifts to the faded floral wallpaper, a cheerful pattern long since worn to a melancholic blur, peeling at the corners where dampness, like a quiet, creeping sickness, has seeped in from the London air, leaving its subtle, insidious mark. The walls themselves feel as if they exhale a chill, a constant, low-level adversary that demands an immediate response from your still slumbering body. Beyond the thin walls, the city itself begins to awaken its distinctive olfactory landscape already asserting itself. The air, even filtered through a closed window, is thick with the pervasive scent of coal smoke, a constant companion to life in London, rising from thousands upon thousands of chimneys across the sprawling metropolis. It clings to everything, a sooty embrace that permeates clothes, hair, and even the very breath you take. Beneath that, subtly but undeniably, you can discern the distinct aroma of the nearby Thames, an ancient river that in this era functions less as a pristine waterway and more as a vast open sewer. It carries the smell of mud and raw sewage, a constant low-frequency hum beneath the daily din, a reminder of the city's less picturesque realities. And then closer, more intimate, is something sweeter, more chemical. The perfumes and cosmetics that are not simply adornments here, but rather, as you have come to understand, the indispensable tools of the trade. They too add their layer to the complex, ever-present scent of this house. With a soft creak from the bed springs, you shift the sound, a quiet accompaniment to your rising consciousness. Your bare feet meet the cold, unyielding floorboards, and the shock of it is immediate. A small, involuntary shiver tracing its way up your spine. The first conscious action of the day is often the same, reaching for the woolen shawl draped over the foot of the bed, wrapping it tightly around your shoulders, a meager but necessary defense against the morning's bite. It's a familiar ritual, a small, unremarked battle won against the encroaching chill. Your roommate Lily, a girl who has been here for about 6 months now, still breathes deeply and steadily in the other bed, her sleep undisturbed by your quiet movements. You allow yourself a moment of stillness, listening to the gentle rhythm of her breathing, a small anchor in the waking world. The first order of business, a small but essential ritual, is the morning wash. A chipped ceramic pitcher stands on the small scarred washstand beside a matching basin. In winter, you've learned to expect a thin film of ice on the surface of the water, a stark visual of London's brutal, unforgiving cold. There's a bracing, almost painful sting as the cold water splashes your face, a shock that fully wakes you, leaving your skin tingling and raw. It's a harsh awakening, but effective. Later, a proper wash will be afforded with the relative luxury of hot water carried up from the kitchen. That's when you'll properly cleanse your face, neck, arms, and underarms with a quick rinse of intimate areas, a professional necessity. Full bathing, however, is a deeper indulgence, only permitted twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays, in a large copper tub situated in the kitchen. Even this, you are keenly aware, is more frequent than many respectable working-class women manage, a strange, small irony in a life so often devoid of ordinary comforts. It is perhaps a testament to Mrs. Cartwright's business acumen, a small investment in the commodity that is your physical presence. It is perhaps a testament to Mrs. Cartwright's business acumen, a small investment in the commodity that is your physical presence. And you, Mary, have been a part of this particular investment for nearly 2 years now. In the fluid, often ephemeral world of London's illicit trades, 2 years makes you something of a fixture, a steady presence in a house where girls like the seasons tend to come and go with a quiet, unremarked regularity. You've seen them all, some with a stroke of luck, or a particularly persistent suitor moved up to slightly grander establishments, perhaps to become the mistress of some wealthy gentleman. Others, less fortunate, simply disappeared, swallowed back into the vast, indifferent maw of poverty from which they emerged. Or worse, fell prey to the insidious diseases that lurked like shadows in every corner of this city, never to recover. Each departure is a quiet ripple in the house, a brief thought, and then the space is filled again. This house itself, nestled on a quiet side street off the perpetually thrumming Haymarket, isn't the worst establishment, not by a long shot. You know of those places, the grimy, overcrowded dens of destitution where desperation hangs thick in the air like a pall, where a shilling buys a minute of misery and safety is a laughable concept. Nor is it by any stretch of the imagination one of the highest ones either, where aristocratic gentlemen might discreetly visit women of notorious beauty and impeccable manners, where the illusion is so perfect it borders on art. No, this house occupies a comfortable, if unglamorous, middle ground. It is clean enough, warm enough, and crucially safe enough, a testament to Mrs. Cartwright's rigorous, if unsentimental, management. As the chill from the wash begins to recede, absorbed by the wool of your shawl, the subtle symphony of the awakening house begins to make itself known. First, from a few streets away, the faint rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves on the cobbled streets, followed by the rattle and rumble of cart wheels transporting goods and burdens across the waking city. Then the first tentative cries of the street vendors, their voices thin and reedy in the crisp morning air. Fresh bread, hot bread, a comforting, almost domestic sound that paradoxically forms part of the daily soundtrack to this very undomestic life. Closer still, within the house itself, you hear the unmistakable footsteps of Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, her gait precise and brisk, already on her rounds. A low clatter follows the sound of coal being shoveled, then the dull roar as a fire is lit downstairs in the parlor. The thought of that burgeoning warmth radiating from the hearth is a small but potent lure. Soon, a more inviting scent will begin to drift upwards, the rich, slightly bitter aroma of real coffee, not the cheap, chicory-laden substitute so common in less fastidious establishments. This, you acknowledge to yourself, is another small luxury that distinguishes this house. A quiet promise of a sustained comfort that many others in your profession are denied. Mrs. Cartwright, it seems, understands that a well-fed, reasonably content woman presents a far more appealing prospect than a half-starved, shivering one. It's simply good business after all. The mundane sounds of London continue to filter through the window, providing a strangely grounding backdrop to the particular reality of your morning. A group of children, their voices surprisingly clear and high, run past in the street below, their laughter momentarily piercing the industrial hum. A dog barks, sharp and sudden, followed by the rhythmic, almost musical call of another street vendor. Knives to grind. Knives to grind. It's a remarkable thing you sometimes reflect how ordinary life persists, utterly indifferent to the extraordinary circumstances that unfold within these otherwise unremarkable brick walls. The baker delivers fresh bread to the brothel, just as he does to the respectable boarding house next door. The coal man, his face perpetually smudged, unloads his sacks outside, no questions asked. The iceman, the draymen, they all come and go, their daily routines weaving the brothel seamlessly, invisibly into the fabric of everyday London. It's as if society in its vast, intricate machinery simply acknowledges a need, provides a service, and quietly looks the other way. This subtle integration, this quiet acceptance of the unacceptable, is a daily paradox you've learned to live with. The world outside, with its children and dogs and street vendors, continues its indifferent turning, while inside a different, equally structured world operates with its own precise rhythms and rituals. And it is this gritty routine, this meticulous organization, that defines your day. The scent of coffee, growing stronger, acts as a gentle siren drawing you down the narrow, creaking stairs. Breakfast is a welcome certainty in this house. Unlike some places where girls might go hungry or be left to scavenge for their own meager sustenance, here there is always a meal. Today it's porridge thick and comforting, sweetened with a generous drizzle of dark treacle, accompanied by that fresh bread, still warm from the baker's delivery. And of course the coffee, deep and dark, chases away the last vestiges of sleep. It's a simple meal, but hearty, designed to provide the necessary fuel for a day that, despite its unconventional nature, demands a quiet, steady energy. The cook, a widow in her 50s named Agnes, is a quiet fixture in the kitchen. She arrived here after her husband's death, left her utterly destitute with no skills, save a talent for making the most of meager ingredients. She never comments on the nature of the business that provides her employment, nor does she offer judgment. She simply cooks, keeping to herself a silent presence, humming tunelessly over her kneading board. Her mantra, if she has one, seems to be a practical, undeniable truth. Good food is the foundation of health. And in this particular line of work, health, as you are acutely aware, is not merely a blessing. It is the absolute bedrock of your livelihood, your most critical asset. After breakfast, the house shifts into its daytime rhythm. Mrs. Cartwright, with her keen eye for order, operates under the firm belief that idle hands lead to trouble. There is no lounging about, no prolonged idleness in this establishment. Even when not entertaining customers, the girls are kept busy, a steady hum of purposeful activity filling the hours. Today, your assigned duties include dusting the parlor, a large, elegantly appointed room on the ground floor, and polishing the glasses in the small bar area. The parlor, like the rest of the house, maintains a veneer of respectability. It's decorated in a style that might be called genteel, with hints of luxury rather than overt opulence. The furniture is solid, well-maintained. The curtains, heavy and clean, filter the London light to a soft, inviting glow. The paintings on the walls are mildly suggestive, perhaps a bare shoulder or a provocative glance, but nothing too obvious. Nothing that would immediately identify this as a brothel to the casual, unsuspecting eye. This careful construction of normalcy, this thin veneer of respectability, is deliberate. It protects everyone, the house, its mistress, the women who work within, and most importantly, the gentlemen who discreetly visit, allowing them to participate in their chosen fantasy without having to confront the stark, often uncomfortable reality. As you move through the parlor, the soft cloth brushing away the accumulated dust of the night, a quiet, almost meditative quality settles over the repetitive work. Each stroke transforms a dull, dust-laden surface into something clean and gleaming. The brass lamp fixtures begin to reflect the soft light. The dark wood of the side tables takes on a deep, satisfying sheen. There's a quiet satisfaction in this tangible transformation, a small, controllable sphere of influence in a life that often feels profoundly beyond your command. Later in the small bar area, you'll take up the polishing of glasses. Each crystal goblet, initially dull and smudged, will slowly come alive under your fingers, gradually transforming from opaque to shining, catching the light in 1,000 tiny prisms. This transformation you've discovered can be profoundly calming, a quiet, rhythmic act of creation amidst the demands of your profession. As you work, the sounds of household industry fill the air. You hear Mrs. Winters, her voice crisp and clear, instructing Betsy, the young maid, on the proper technique for blacking the kitchen range. The cook, Agnes, continues to hum tunelessly from the kitchen, the rhythmic thump of dough being kneaded, providing a steady beat. Overhead, you catch the light footsteps of Lily as she makes the beds in the upper rooms. Another quiet testament to the ceaseless, organized activity of the house. It's a domestic symphony of sorts, a strange, inverted echo of a respectable household, yet one that in its own way offers a peculiar sense of stability. But underlying this quiet rhythm, like a low, ever-present hum, is the constant awareness of risk. It's a reality that touches every aspect of your life here, from the food you eat to the cleaning supplies you use. And nowhere is it more acutely felt than in the realm of health. Nowhere is the acute awareness of risk more pronounced than in the realm of health. This house, unlike many others in its profession, operates under a strictest rule, one that Mrs. Cartwright enforces with an almost religious zeal: the weekly medical examination. Every Wednesday, without fail, Dr. Harrison pays his visit. This unwavering regularity, you know, is one of the primary reasons her house maintains its relatively unblemished reputation among its clientele. Any girl showing even the slightest symptoms of illness, particularly those that might be considered occupational hazards, is immediately removed from work. She is then treated at the house's expense, a policy that, while expensive in the short term for Mrs. Cartwright, is a shrewd investment, ensuring the long-term viability of her business. After all, a healthy workforce is a profitable workforce, even in this line of work. Dr. Harrison himself is a man of about 50, with neatly trimmed graying hair and a precise beard that frames a largely unreadable face. And here, too, there is a small but significant difference from your expectations or from the grim stories you've heard from other girls. Unlike many doctors who serve this industry, who often treat the women with an open contempt or an unnecessary roughness, his manner is remarkably professional. His touch is clinical, yes, but not punitive. There's a quiet courtesy in his standard, opening a small acknowledgement that for these few moments at least, You are a person, not merely a body to be examined. How have you been keeping any concerns to report? He asks, his voice low and steady, a small, almost imperceptible softening around the eyes. It's a question that invites a truthful answer, not a defensive one, and it is a small, unexpected courtesy in a world where courtesy is rarely extended to women in your position. The examination itself is brief, efficient, and thorough. He checks your breathing, listens to your heart rate with his stethoscope, examines your throat and eyes. Then comes the more intimate check, the part you've learned to compartmentalize. It is quick and impersonal, his touch protected by thin, almost imperceptible gloves. You've long since developed a coping mechanism for this part, a kind of psychological detachment that allows you to float above the immediate physical reality. You think of other things during these moments. The book waiting unfinished in your room. The sweet, comforting taste of the currant bun you'll have when this is over. The brief stolen feel of winter sunshine on your face in the small yard. You create a small internal sanctuary, a private space where the demands of the body do not fully infringe upon the quiet workings of the mind. All appears to be in order, Mary. He pronounces, his voice calm as he withdraws and gestures for you to redress. It's always a relief, that quiet pronouncement, a small victory against an unseen enemy. But the doctor's visit, even when the news is good, always prompts a quiet internal reflection. It is an inescapable reminder of the inherent risks of this life, the ever-present shadow of diseases that can ravage a woman's body, bringing not just pain and disfigurement, but eventually, irrevocably, death. You have seen others succumb, a persistent cough that worsens over weeks, suspicious sores that bloom unpleasantly, and then, inevitably, a quiet disappearance from the house. Sometimes, if she's lucky, a girl will be sent to one of the charitable hospitals that dot the city. More often, you suspect they simply disappear into the vast, uncaring anonymity of London, left to suffer alone. It's a calculated risk. This life, a constant weighing of the certainty of starvation in more respectable work against the insidious, terrifying possibility of disease in this one. A grim calculus, to be sure, but one you and so many like you have been forced to make. Yet even within this realm of inherent risk, there are small, surprising luxuries, moments of personal respite that act as brief restorative balms. As you dress after the examination, you reach for a small lump of beeswax, warming it between your palms, then smoothing it gently over your chapped lips. It's a small, almost imperceptible act of self-care insisted upon by Mrs. Cartwright. Another one of her quiet, practical demands that serve both her business and your comfort. Your hands, despite the harsh soap and water required for constant cleanliness, are still relatively soft and smooth. Another necessity, you know. Customers don't want to feel calloused hands on their skin. These small tactile comforts, these moments of gentle self-attention, are like tiny acts of defiance against the coarseness of your reality. These small tactile comforts, these moments of gentle self-attention, are like tiny acts of defiance against the coarseness of your reality. There are other such moments, brief but potent. You remember the pure, unexpected physical pleasure of a recent morning hanging laundry in the small enclosed yard at the back of the house. The weak winter sunlight, so often obscured by London's perpetual cloud cover, had broken through, falling directly onto your face and hands. It was a fleeting sensation, asking nothing of you, demanding no performance or pretense, just the simple, unadulterated sensation of light and air on your skin. A quiet, almost spiritual moment of grace utterly detached from the demands of your profession. And then there are the errands. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, occasionally dispatches you into the outside world, usually to fetch some forgotten item from the market or to deliver a discreet message. These are moments you savor. Walking outside, navigating the uneven pavement, dodging the constant stream of horse-drawn carriages and bustling pedestrians. There is a curious freedom in this anonymity, in these brief excursions into ordinary life. For a short while, you are simply another young woman in a modest wool dress, blending into the ebb and flow of London's vast, indifferent crowd. No one looks twice. No one knows. This brief anonymity is a profound comfort, a temporary release from the scrutiny and judgment that defines so much of your existence within the house. One such errand recently involved a trip to the baker's for a special order of spiced buns for Mrs. Cartwright. On the way back, with a few coppers in your pocket from Mrs. Winters for a small personal treat, you spotted a street vendor selling jam tarts. You bought one, the pastry still warm, the strawberry filling sweet and tangy. You ate it slowly, deliberately, while you walked, savoring each bite, the simple, unadulterated pleasure of a sweet indulgence. These small interactions with the outside world, these fleeting moments of shared, unremarked humanity, have their own peculiar pleasure. The pretense of normality, the brief, delicious escape from your actual circumstances. You play the role of a respectable young woman with perfect conviction, your face serene, your eyes meeting no one's gaze. For too long, a quiet, almost mischievous joy bubbling beneath the surface. Of course, the fantasy has its limits, its boundaries. You know precisely which streets you don't walk down, which shops you don't enter. The respectable tea room where ladies meet their friends, their parasols neatly folded beside their chairs, is not for you. The church, with its judgmental spire reaching towards a seemingly indifferent heaven, seems to follow you with invisible condemning eyes. There's a line often invisible, but always present, that you must not cross a boundary that reinforces the separation between your world and theirs. Back within the walls of the house, there are internal spaces that offer a different kind of mental respite. The quiet moment after a customer leaves, for instance, when the door has clicked shut and the lingering scent of cologne begins to fade. It is oddly peaceful, a pause between acts, a breath between words. In these moments, you consciously reset, allowing your mind to drift, helping you to maintain the necessary boundaries between your professional persona and your inner self. You learn to not carry one encounter into the next, to shed the previous interaction like an outer garment. Similarly, there is the small pocket of stillness that occurs after dinner and before the evening's full activity commences. The grand parlor and the other reception rooms on the ground floor are quiet now, awaiting the influx of evening customers. This is a period of relative freedom, a brief interlude where you can retreat to your room, read a book, or simply sit in companionable silence with Lily. It is a moment of quiet anticipation, a drawing of breath before the plunge. And then there is the kitchen at night. After the cook has retired and only Mrs. Winters and perhaps Betsy are still stirring, the kitchen becomes the true heart of the house. It is the warmest room still radiating the comfortable heat from the large range filled with the lingering smells of baked bread and hearty stews. It has its own particular charm, a lived-in warmth that is profoundly comforting. It's here after the early evening lull that a late supper is left out for the girls. Bread, cheese, cold meats, and sometimes a sweet fruit tart, a quiet gesture of Mrs. Cartwright's practical care. But perhaps the most profound of these internal spaces is the private bedroom you share with Lily. It is a familiar simplicity, this small room adorned with only the bare necessities. But crucially, fundamentally, No customers ever come here. This is your sanctuary, a purely private space, a quiet haven. It is the one place in the house that belongs just to you and your roommate, a quiet bastion of self, a space where you can finally shed the layers of pretense and simply, truly be. It is here, too, that the journey that led you to this life often surfaces in your thoughts, a silent, unfolding narrative. It is here in the quiet sanctuary of your shared room that the journey that led you to this life often surfaces in your thoughts, a silent, unfolding narrative. Your path to the brothel, you often reflect, might not be what you'd expect. The stories of girls kidnapped and sold into this work as children, or seduced, and then cruelly abandoned by some heartless gentleman, were not your stories. Though you knew well enough that such tragedies, grimly predictable, happened to some girls, their desperate circumstances twisting them into lives they never chose. No, your descent into this particular reality was a slower, colder process, a gradual slide fueled by an entirely different kind of desperation, economic. You had been a seamstress, and by all accounts, a good one. You possessed nimble fingers, a keen eye for detail, and the patience required for intricate stitching. You could turn out delicate embroidery or fashion a perfectly tailored bodice with precision. But London in the 1850s was a city overflowing with such skills. There were hundreds of women like you, thousands even, all competing fiercely for the same miserably paid work. The market was flooded, demand was low, and wages were driven relentlessly downwards by desperate competition. The drudgery of the profession, as you knew from bitter experience, was soul-crushing. A contemporary British quarterly writer, observing the plight of dressmakers' apprentices, once dryly remarked that, compared to the drudgery of a dressmaker's apprentice, factory work was mere play. You understood the grim truth of that statement more intimately than any writer ever could. Your personal experience was a relentless cycle of toil and deprivation. You worked 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, your eyes straining in the poor, flickering light of a single gas lamp, or by the weak, grudging allowance of a single candle. Your fingers, despite their nimble precision, were often cracked and bleeding in the biting winter cold, their delicate tips a canvas of tiny pinpricks. And for all this exhausting labor, you earned starvation wages barely enough to keep a roof, however leaky, over your head in a rented room barely larger than a cupboard. The constant gnawing fear of the workhouse, the ultimate destination for the destitute, was a cold, ever-present companion. The turning point came 3 winters ago, a particularly brutal season that bit deep into the city's bones. You hadn't eaten in 2 days, your stomach a hollow, aching void. Your rented room, even smaller and colder than your current one, was unheated. You could see your own breath misting in the frigid air as you worked frantically trying to finish an impossibly tight deadline for a set of delicate lace cuffs. Your fingers numb with cold and hunger kept pricking themselves with the needle, leaving tiny, almost invisible spots of blood on the fine white linen. Each stain was a small, frustrating setback, each prick a fresh reminder of your body's increasing rebellion against your will. It was then that Jane visited. You knew Jane, or at least you had known her from the brief occasional interactions in the shared, grimy communal kitchens of your previous lodging houses. But she looked different now. Healthier, undeniably, better fed. She wore a clean, warm wool dress, a garment of surprising quality that spoke volumes about her changed circumstances. And then she produced it actual hot food. A meat pie still steaming, its savory aroma filling your frigid room with an almost overwhelming richness. It was a gesture of profound kindness, a lifeline tossed into a storm. As you devoured the pie, the warmth spreading through your chilled body. Jane spoke, her voice low and steady. "There's a place, Mary," she said, "a house off Haymarket. The madam is strict but fair. No funny business, no cruelty. 2 meals a day and a decent bed, medical checks weekly." The words, delivered without fanfare or judgment, hung in the cold air, stark in their implications. And then she added the brutal, undeniable truth, the offer that cut through all the social condemnation and moralizing. "You'd make in a night what you make in a week here, Mary, and you wouldn't be killing yourself with this. You had been raised properly in a God-fearing home, but your parents were dead, your brothers scattered. You were slowly starving to death, one stitch at a time. The choice presented with such chilling clarity was no choice at all. And so, with a quiet, desperate resolve, you stepped across an invisible threshold from one form of difficult survival to another. And thus your personal journey began a reluctant path into a world of performance and pretense of purchased intimacy and carefully guarded truths. And thus your personal journey began a reluctant path into a world of performance and pretense of purchased intimacy and carefully guarded truths. The brothel's doors, once a symbol of societal condemnation, had become a refuge, a strange inverted sanctuary offering a brutal practicality. Your days now, though still structured and demanding, unfolded with a different kind of rhythm. After the quiet industriousness of the morning polishing and cleaning, attending to the meticulous duties Mrs. Cartwright assigned, there would be a midday meal, often a hearty, simple stew, followed by a brief lull before the afternoon callers began to arrive. It's during these afternoon hours that the house's purpose becomes more overtly manifest, albeit still cloaked in a carefully maintained discretion. The first customers of the day are typically those seeking a quieter, perhaps more hurried encounter, men of business, or those with specific tastes that prefer the light of day. One such encounter a few weeks ago perfectly encapsulated the subtle complexities of your work, the visit of Mr. Wilson. Your initial impression of Mr. Wilson was that he was a new customer. He was middle-aged, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a well-cut but not ostentatious dark coat. His manner was polite, almost excessively so, and a touch awkward, a quiet deference that was both disarming and in its way a small relief. As Mrs. Cartwright, ever the consummate hostess, introduced him, your professional persona seamlessly clicked into place. Your voice, without conscious effort, became a touch softer, slightly more refined, shedding the traces of London's coarser cadences. You dropped a small curtsy, not too deep, just enough to show proper manners, a delicate gesture that subtly reinforced the fiction of a social encounter rather than a commercial transaction. The ritual of the drink followed a social nicety meticulously cultivated by Mrs. Cartwright. She would offer sherry or brandy, a polite prelude designed to ease the transaction, to allow the gentleman to transition from the clamor of the street to the hushed intimacy of the parlor. You observed Mr. Wilson as he accepted a glass of sherry, noting the small details, the telltale signs that revealed a glimpse of the man beneath the polite facade. His clothes, while of good quality, showed subtle signs of wear, a slight sheen at the elbows, a barely perceptible fray at the cuff. His hands, though clean and well kept, were slightly roughened, his nails trimmed short but not manicured. These were the hands of a working man, perhaps a merchant or a shop owner, someone accustomed to honest labor, but clearly with sufficient means to seek out the particular comforts this house offered. The conversation, as always, was a delicate dance. You inquired about his day, about the weather, about the latest news, carefully choosing neutral topics that invited polite, undemanding responses. You listened attentively, offering small, encouraging nods, creating an atmosphere of warmth and genuine interest. It was a performance, yes, but one executed with such practiced sincerity that it could almost feel real. This careful construction of rapport, this weaving of a temporary fragile connection, was as much a part of the service as the physical act itself. It was the illusion he was truly purchasing the brief respite from a world that perhaps offered him little softness or understanding. After the conversation, the unspoken negotiation, the clear understanding of what would and would not happen, settled into the air. When the physical encounter itself was over, Mr. Wilson lingered, his head resting on your shoulder, your hand stroking his hair gently. This, too, was part of what he had purchased, the illusion of intimacy, of being cared for, of finding a quiet, undemanding comfort. There was no passionate embrace, no declaration of affection, just a comfortable stillness. When he finally rose to leave, he pressed a small additional coin into your hand, a tip. "You've been very kind," he murmured, his eyes meeting yours with a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps simply a quiet relief. You responded as you always did with, "It was my pleasure." But this time the words held more sincerity than usual. Mr. Wilson was a good customer, polite and undemanding, and his departure left behind a feeling not of weariness, but of a job quietly, competently done. As Mrs. Winters appeared as if by magic to discreetly escort him out, ensuring he didn't encounter anyone coming in, you felt a brief moment of quiet contentment. The thin veneer that makes the unacceptable acceptable, you reflected, protects everyone, not least of all the discreet gentlemen who step out of the respectable world for a moment and then quietly slip back in. The thin veneer that makes the unacceptable acceptable, you reflected, protects everyone, not least of all the discreet gentlemen who step out of the respectable world for a moment and then quietly slip back in. This pretense of normalcy, this carefully constructed illusion, pervades every aspect of the brothel's operation. Even the external appearance of the house is meticulously managed. From the street it presents as nothing more than a respectably maintained townhouse with clean curtains in the windows and a freshly painted, unassuming door. There's no red light, no obvious sign to identify it as a brothel. It blends seamlessly into the row of terraced houses indistinguishable from the other residences that line the quiet side street. This deliberate anonymity is crucial. Legally, the situation is a delicate dance. Brothels themselves aren't strictly illegal in Victorian London, or at least the law regarding them is often applied with a selective blindness. Public solicitation. Yes, that is illegal, and police patrols would certainly clamp down on any overt displays of their trade on the streets. But established houses like Mrs. Cartwright's, especially those that understand the unwritten rules of the city, which often include the payment of expected discreet bribes to certain constables, are generally left alone. It's a pragmatic arrangement, a tacit understanding between the keepers of order and those who provide a necessary, if morally condemned, service. This quiet tolerance allows the business to operate without undue interference, a testament to the complex, often contradictory moral landscape of the era. Customers then don't stumble upon the house by accident. They know to come here through a subtle, intricate network. Word of mouth, a whispered recommendation among a certain set of gentlemen, is paramount. There are also discreet advertisements in certain niche publications, the kind not openly displayed on newsstands. And crucially, there's the informal network of cab drivers and hotel porters who, for a small commission, discreetly direct gentlemen this way, their hushed suggestions acting as a subtle, effective form of marketing. It's a subterranean economy, operating just beneath the surface of polite society, its channels and currents understood by those who navigate its waters. For the gentlemen who arrive, discretion is not just a preference, it's an expectation. They don't want reality, not the reality of a working woman's difficult life, certainly not the grim realities of poverty or the indignities of a truly desperate existence. What they seek is fantasy escape. They desire something different from their respectable wives and homes, something that makes them feel special or powerful, or simply seen in a way they might not be in their constrained domestic lives. And you, Mary, are a key architect of this fantasy. Your role is to provide that illusion, to embody the desired escape. This is why when you venture out on errands during the day, your clothes are ordinary, unassuming. Nothing that would mark you out as different from any other working woman. Discretion is still necessary even in the bustling anonymity of the streets. The daytime customers too often expect a more natural look, one that aligns with the fiction that this is somehow a spontaneous, less formal encounter rather than a business transaction. No heavy makeup, no overtly suggestive attire. The illusion must be maintained even in its subtlest forms. And sometimes, even after all this time, the normality of it all still strikes you as strange, a curious paradox. The fact that this work, this very profession that society so vehemently condemns as the ultimate female degradation, happens right alongside ordinary London life. The baker delivering bread, the children playing in the street, the vendor crying out his wares, all existing in parallel, their rhythms occasionally intersecting, yet fundamentally separate in their moral implications. It's a disorienting reality, one that highlights the profound hypocrisy that underpins so much of Victorian society. The same society that creates the conditions making this life a necessary evil simultaneously provides the demand that makes it profitable. It's a circular, self-sustaining system of moral contradiction. But within this strange system, there are other currents, other bonds. The house, after all, is not simply a place of commerce. It is for many a home, a fragile community. But within this strange system, there are other currents, other bonds. The house, after all, is not simply a place of commerce. It is for many a home, a fragile community. You find perhaps unexpectedly a quiet solidarity among the women here. This camaraderie is one of the unexpected benefits of the life, a shared understanding that creates bonds despite the inherently competitive nature of the work. You and Lily, your roommate, share a common dream, one whispered in the quiet hours before sleep, or during the brief unguarded moments of the day, saving enough to escape London to start fresh somewhere else, perhaps by the seaside far from the choking smog and the judging eyes. It is a common dream among the girls, a flickering beacon of hope against the persistent darkness. This shared understanding manifests in small everyday gestures. When a new customer arrives, for instance, there's a subtle exchange of information. Wilson knew one. Someone might murmur a question that is partly gossip, yes, but more importantly, partly practical. Knowing what to expect from each visitor, their temperament, their preferences, their peculiarities, makes the work easier, safer, and less demanding. It's an informal intelligence network, a collective memory built on shared experiences. You can speak freely with each other in a way that would be impossible with outsiders. There's no need to explain, to justify, to defend your choices. Just acceptance of the harsh reality you all share, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken contract that binds you. This camaraderie extends to small acts of mutual aid, gestures of care that transcend the transactional nature of your profession. Helping Lily with the endless array of tiny buttons on her evening dress before the night's work begins, for example, is not a chore, but an act of shared preparation. There's an exchange of compliments and reassurance, a quiet ritual of bolstering each other's spirits before stepping out to face the evening's demands. "You look beautiful, Lily." You might say, smoothing a fold in her velvet gown, and she in turn will adjust a stray curl in your hair, offering a sincere, "You too, Mary." These small interactions are like tiny anchors grounding you in a shared humanity before you embark on the often dehumanizing performance of the night. The shared meal, particularly dinner, is another moment of community, a brief oasis of normalcy before the individual work of the evening begins. It's served in the dining room rather than the kitchen, a subtle distinction that elevates the occasion, a reinforcement of the standards Mrs. Cartwright expects. The food is always hearty, a rich beef stew with plenty of vegetables, fresh bread, a comforting rice pudding, and a glass of wine. It's good filling food designed to provide energy for the long evening ahead, a practical necessity disguised as a small indulgence. Mrs. Cartwright herself often presides at the head of the table, dressed in her own elegant evening gown, her presence further reinforcing the sense of occasion. Her role, you've come to understand, is complex. She is undoubtedly an employer running a business with shrewd practicality. But she is also, in her own unsentimental way, a protector disciplinarian, and sometimes even a quiet mentor. There is a necessary distance, she maintains a professional detachment, but there is no cruelty in her management, no unnecessary harshness. Her business mantra is clear. Quality of service, not quantity, is what maintains our reputation. It's this emphasis on discretion, on a certain level of comfort and even dignity, that distinguishes her house from the myriad others in London. After dinner, and before the full surge of evening customers, there is that small pocket of stillness you so value. It's a period of relative freedom, a time when the house is quiet, the public rooms awaiting their transformation into bustling spaces of entertainment. You might retreat to your shared room with Lily, perhaps read a book borrowed from Mrs. Cartwright's small, surprisingly well-stocked library, or simply sit in comfortable silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the house preparing for the night. This is where you consciously maintain boundaries, learning to not carry one encounter into the next, to shed the previous interaction like an outer garment. This protective boundary you've discovered is essential. It helps preserve some core of self amid the incessant demands of the work, allowing for the crucial shift from private person to professional and back again. It is a deliberate act of self-preservation, a vital piece of the mental armor you wear. It is a deliberate act of self-preservation, a vital piece of the mental armor you wear. This constant negotiation between the inner self and the external performance is a cornerstone of your existence here. The shared knowledge and unspoken understanding among the girls provide profound comfort in this shared reality, this lack of need for explanation or elaboration. With them, you are simply Mary, the woman who has seen what they have seen, who understands the unspoken language of this particular life. There is no need for pretense, no need to perform. As the afternoon light begins to dim, giving way to the deeper shadows of evening, the house undergoes another subtle transformation. The quiet industry of the day shifts into the anticipatory hum of the night. It is time to prepare for the evening's work, a shift that is as much psychological as it is physical. Your daytime clothes, the ordinary wool dress that allows you to blend seamlessly into the anonymous throngs of London, are shed. These are replaced by your evening attire, a costume of sorts, a uniform for the role you are about to play. These clothes are designed to be more elaborate, more revealing, yet still within the bounds of what Mrs. Cartwright deems tasteful for her establishment. Perhaps a gown of deep velvet, its rich fabric catching the light, or silk that rustles softly with every movement. The necklines are lower. The sleeves might be shorter, exposing a graceful shoulder or the delicate curve of an arm. It's an investment you understand in this profession. These garments, though, they are not your own in the deepest sense. Owned by the house or purchased with money that ultimately cycles back into the house's expenses, are crucial. They help to attract a better class of customer men who appreciate beauty and a certain refinement, and in turn they allow you to command higher prices, bringing more income to the house and a larger share to you. The fabric itself, a fine cotton chemise and drawers, feels vastly different from the rough utilitarian fabrics of your seamstress days. Even the simple undergarments are softer, more luxurious, a small, intimate comfort that hints at the illusion of opulence you are meant to embody. As Lily helps you with the dozens of tiny buttons that run down the back of your gown, your fingers deft and practiced. You share a quiet moment of shared preparation. It's an intimate act, this shared ritual of dressing, and in the mirror you see not just your reflection, but a subtle shift in your expression. The daytime Mary, the quiet observer, recedes, replaced by the professional persona, the one who is attentive, charming, and apparently delighted by each man's company, regardless of the deeper reality. You smooth your hair, perhaps adding a decorative comb or a small ribbon, and apply a touch more of that faintly chemical sweet perfume. It's all part of the carefully constructed artifice, the transformation from working woman to an object of desire and fantasy. This external transformation helps to solidify the internal boundary, creating the necessary distance between your true self and the demands of the performance. When you finally step out of your room ready for the evening, you carry yourself with a different posture, a subtle grace that belies the weary pragmatism that brought you here. This transition from the quiet reflections of the morning to the readiness for the evening underscores the stark contrasts that define your life. It is a life shaped by an economic desperation that few outside your world could truly comprehend. Your earlier life as a seamstress, though morally unimpeachable in the eyes of society, was a slow, agonizing descent into physical and emotional depletion. It was a life where the fight for basic survival overshadowed all else. It was a life where the fight for basic survival overshadowed all else, a stark, unyielding struggle that gradually eroded your very being. Your journey to this brothel, your reluctant path into this profession, was not as you've often reflected the sensationalized tale of abduction or tragic seduction that society might prefer to imagine. No, your narrative was far more common, far more insidious. It was the grinding, relentless pressure of poverty. You weren't kidnapped or sold into this work as a child, though you knew that such heartbreaking fates befell other unfortunate girls. Nor were you seduced and then cruelly abandoned by some charming, unscrupulous gentleman, leaving you with no other option. These stories you knew happened to some girls, to many girls even, but they were not yours. Your story was one of sheer economic desperation, a quiet, incremental starvation. You were, as you often told yourself, a good seamstress. Your nimble fingers, honed by years of practice, could execute intricate stitches with remarkable precision. You had a keen eye for detail, a steady hand, and the patience for hours of repetitive, painstaking work. You could fashion delicate lace, repair fine silks, or tailor a man's waistcoat with a skill that was undeniably valuable. But in the vast, churning metropolis of London, your skill was a dime a dozen. Hundreds of women like you Thousands even poured into the city from the countryside or emerged from impoverished urban homes, all competing fiercely for the same limited pool of poorly paid work. The market was saturated, and your skills, however refined, offered little leverage in the face of such overwhelming competition. The drudgery of the profession was in itself a slow form of torture. You would work 14, sometimes even 16 hours a day, bending over your needlework, your back aching, your neck stiff. The light was almost always inadequate, straining your eyes in the dim glow of a single candle or a flickering gas jet. In the brutal London winters, your fingers, despite their dexterity, would often be cracked and bleeding from the cold, tiny pinpricks of blood, often marring the fine fabrics you painstakingly worked upon. For all this exhausting, soul-sapping labor, you earned starvation wages. The few shillings you received were barely enough to keep a flimsy roof over your head in a cramped, unheated, rented room, let alone provide proper sustenance. The constant gnawing fear of the workhouse, that dreaded final destination for the truly destitute, was a cold, ever-present companion, whispering its grim warnings in the quiet hours of the night. The turning point. The moment of undeniable decision came during a particularly brutal winter 3 years prior to your arrival at Mrs. Cartwright's. The cold was a living entity that season, creeping into every crack and crevice, settling deep into your bones. You hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, your stomach a hollow, aching void that constantly reverberated with hunger pangs. Your rented room, even smaller and colder than any you'd had before, was utterly unheated. You remember clearly seeing your own breath misting in the frigid air as you worked frantically, desperately trying to finish a rush order of fine linen collars. The deadline was impossibly tight, the pay barely worth the effort, but it was all you had. Your fingers, numb with cold and hunger, kept pricking themselves with the needle, leaving tiny, almost invisible spots of blood on the pristine white fabric. Each stain was a small, frustrating setback, each prick a fresh, sharp reminder of your body's increasing rebellion against your will, a mute testament to your desperate plight. It was then that Jane appeared, a girl you'd known briefly from a previous, even grimmer lodging house. You remembered her as thin, perpetually hunched over her own needlework, her face pale with hunger. But the Jane who stood before you that brutal winter day was strikingly different. She looked healthier, undeniably better fed. Her cheeks had a faint flush of color, and her eyes, though still carrying the quiet wisdom of hardship, held a newfound light. She wore a clean, warm wool dress, a garment of surprising quality that spoke volumes about her changed circumstances. And then, the most astonishing thing she produced, actual hot food. A meat pie still steaming, its savory aroma filling your frigid room with an almost overwhelming richness. A scent so potent it brought a sudden, unexpected sting to your eyes. It was a gesture of profound kindness, a lifeline tossed into a storm you thought was boundless. It was a gesture of profound kindness, a lifeline tossed into a storm you thought was boundless. As you devoured the pie, the warmth spreading through your chilled body, a small, tentative hope began to unfurl within you. Jane watched you eat, her gaze steady, devoid of pity, filled only with a quiet understanding. And then she spoke, her voice low and even, delivering the stark truth that would reshape your life. "There's a place, Mary," she said, "a house off Haymarket. The madam is strict but fair. No funny business, no cruelty. 2 meals a day and a decent bed, medical checks weekly." The words, delivered without fanfare or judgment, hung in the cold air, stark in their implications, yet surprisingly devoid of the moral weight society typically assigned to them. Jane then added the brutal, undeniable truth the economic reality that cut through all the social condemnation and moralizing that would otherwise define such a choice. You'd make in a night what you make in a week here. "Mary," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming a shared secret between you, and you wouldn't be killing yourself with this. You had been raised properly in a God-fearing home in a small village nestled quietly in the shires far from the choking anonymity of London. You had been taught the virtues of hard work, modesty, and the rigid moral code expected of a respectable young woman. But your parents were long dead, taken by one of the swift fevers that periodically swept through the countryside, leaving entire families decimated. Your brothers, seeking their own desperate fortunes, had scattered to distant industrial towns, lost to the indifferent tides of circumstance. You were alone in this vast, unforgiving city, slowly, irrevocably starving to death one tiny, meticulous stitch at a time. The choice, when Jane laid it bare with such chilling clarity, was no choice at all. It was not a question of good versus evil, but of survival versus oblivion. And so, with a quiet, desperate resolve that felt more like resignation than conviction, you stepped across an invisible threshold from one form of difficult survival to another. The details of that first journey to Mrs. Cartwright's house are blurred by time and the shock of decision. You remember the cold cobblestones beneath your thin boots, the smell of coal smoke mingling with the sharper tang of horse dung, the anonymous, indifferent faces of the London crowds. You remember the quiet, almost conspiratorial knock on Mrs. Cartwright's discreetly painted door, the brief appraising glance from Mrs. Winters, and then the sudden unexpected warmth of the parlor fire. It was a trade you understood of one kind of hardship for another, a practical calculation made in the crucible of absolute necessity. From that moment, your life became a careful navigation of a new reality, one defined by the subtle art of performance. Your interactions with customers became a series of distinct encounters, each with its own nuances, its own unspoken rules. You learned quickly, adapting your behavior, your speech, even your expressions to suit the man across from you. It was a skill you realized as intricate and demanding as any needlework you had ever mastered. There was, for instance, Mr. Wilson, the archetypal polite client whom you encountered most often in the quiet, more sedate hours of the late afternoon. You had learned to read him quickly, middle-aged, well-cut, but not ostentatious dark coat, his politeness almost bordering on awkwardness. He was often a new customer, one still finding his way in this clandestine world. For him, your professional persona clicked into place with practiced ease. Your voice would become a touch softer, slightly more refined, shedding the casual cadences of daily life within the house. You'd drop a small curtsy, not too deep, just enough to show proper manners, a delicate gesture that subtly reinforced the fiction of a social encounter rather than a crass commercial transaction. The ritual of the drink would follow Mrs. Cartwright's unspoken directive for easing the transition. Sherry or brandy offered with a quiet grace, a way of allowing the gentleman to settle, to shed the clamor of the outside world before engaging with the particular intimacy on offer. You would observe Mr. Wilson as he accepted his glass, noting the small details that always spoke volumes. His clothes good quality but showing subtle signs of wear, a slight sheen at the elbows, a barely perceptible fray at the cuff. His hands, though clean and well kept, were slightly roughened, his nails trimmed short but not manicured. These were the hands of a working man, perhaps a merchant or a shop owner, someone who understood the value of industry, but who clearly sought something beyond the confines of his respectable, perhaps unexciting life. These were the hands of a working man, perhaps a merchant or a shop owner, someone who understood the value of industry, but who clearly sought something beyond the confines of his respectable, perhaps unexciting life. The conversation that followed was a delicate, well-rehearsed dance. You'd inquire about his day, about the unpredictable London weather, about the latest news from the papers, carefully selecting neutral topics that invited polite, undemanding responses. You listened attentively, offering small, encouraging nods, creating an atmosphere of warmth and genuine interest. It was a performance, yes, but one executed with such practiced sincerity that it could almost feel real. This careful construction of rapport, this weaving of a temporary fragile connection, was as much a part of the service as the physical act itself. It was the illusion he was truly purchasing the brief respite from a world that perhaps offered him little softness or understanding. After the conversation, the unspoken negotiation, the clear understanding of what would and would not happen settled into the air. It was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a silent acknowledgement of the transition from polite discourse to the true purpose of the visit. When the physical encounter itself was over, Mr. Wilson surprisingly often lingered. His head would rest on your shoulder, his breathing soft and even, and your hand would instinctively stroke his hair gently, a gesture of comfort that for a fleeting moment felt almost natural. This, too, was part of what he had purchased, the illusion of intimacy, of being cared for, of finding a quiet, undemanding comfort. There was no passionate embrace, no declaration of affection, just a comfortable stillness that spoke of a temporary peace. When he finally rose to leave, he would press a small additional coin into your hand, a quiet tip beyond the standard fee, a gesture that bespoke a particular satisfaction. "You've been very kind," he would murmur, his eyes meeting yours, with a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps simply a quiet relief at the experience having been so smooth, so unremarkable. You would respond, as you always did, with, "It was my pleasure." But with Mr. Wilson, the words held more sincerity than usual. He was in the hierarchy of customers, a good one, polite, undemanding, and generous in his small ways. His departure left behind a feeling not of weariness, but of a job quietly, competently done. As Mrs. Winters appeared as if by magic to discreetly escort him out, ensuring he didn't encounter anyone coming in, you felt a brief moment of quiet contentment. The thin veneer that makes the unacceptable acceptable, you reflected, protects everyone, not least of all the discreet gentlemen who step out of the respectable world for a moment and then quietly slip back in. As the afternoon shifted into evening, the nature of the clientele began to change. The quiet, almost furtive visits of men like Mr. Wilson gave way to a more boisterous, often more demanding crowd. It was during these evening hours that you encountered men like Mr. Hamilton, a figure who surprisingly offered a different, more intellectual kind of engagement. Your initial impression of Mr. Hamilton was immediately striking. He was tall, perhaps in his late 30s, with the well-fed look of prosperity and the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. His clothes were expensively tailored, and they draped over him with an easy elegance that spoke of old money and an established position. When Mrs. Cartwright introduced him, her voice holding a subtle note of deference, her words were carefully chosen. "Mary, this is Mr. Hamilton, one of our most accomplished young ladies." The implication was clear: he was important, and you were expected to deliver a superior experience. His assessment of you was immediate. His eyes, a sharp, discerning gray, assessed you with obvious appreciation, but without the overtly leering quality that some men displayed. There was an intellectual curiosity in his gaze, a subtle hint that he was looking beyond the surface. The standard procedure followed financial arrangements, handled discreetly by Mrs. Cartwright in her office, a necessary but unstated transaction that maintained the fiction that this was a social encounter rather than a commercial one. But then came the unusual instruction delivered to you in a low murmur from Mrs. Cartwright. I believe you'll find you have much in common to discuss. It was a clear signal that he had paid for more than just physical service. He had paid for conversation for intellectual engagement. This was a specific requirement, an unusual one in your experience, and it piqued your curiosity. This was a specific requirement, an unusual one in your experience, and it piqued your curiosity. You led Mr. Hamilton to one of the smaller, more private parlors, dimly lit and furnished with plush velvet chairs and a small, discreet table. The atmosphere was designed to encourage conversation, to foster a sense of intimate discourse rather than overt display. As you sat opposite him, pouring a glass of sherry from the decanter, provided you braced yourself for the usual conversational gambits, the polite flirtations, the veiled compliments. But Mr. Hamilton deviated from the script almost immediately. His gaze, though still appraising, held a directness that was unsettling in its sincerity. After a few polite exchanges about the weather and the latest London news, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate, almost conspiratorial tone. "How did you come to be here?" He asked his question, startling in its directness, utterly unlike any you had received from a customer before. He elaborated, "You seem different from what I expected." It was a question that broke through the carefully constructed facade, demanding a glimpse of the true reality beneath. For a moment, you hesitated, weighing your options. The professional persona dictated a vague, perhaps romanticized response, a hint of a tragic backstory. But something in his gaze, perhaps that intellectual curiosity, perhaps a subtle weariness that mirrored your own, prompted a different approach. You decided in a rare moment of professional rebellion to give him a taste of the unvarnished truth. "I was a seamstress." You began, your voice low, factual. "A good one with nimble fingers. But the pay wasn't enough to live on, not truly live. It was starvation, marry one stitch at a time. This," you gestured vaguely around the opulent room. "This pays better. The hours are shorter. The conditions more comfortable. There is food and warmth and a bed that is not frozen." He listened intently, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "A rational economic decision, then," he mused as if speaking to himself, but his eyes were fixed on yours. You met his gaze squarely. "Yes," you agreed, adding with a flicker of your subtle dry wit, "though not one society views rationally, I suspect." And then, remarkably, the conversation continued in this unexpected direction. He began to discuss the broader economic conditions of London, the plight of the working classes, the prevailing moral attitudes towards women, the systemic inequalities that forced women like you into such choices. He spoke of Adam Smith, of utilitarianism, of the social contract. You found yourself drawn into a genuine discussion of economics, morality, and gender politics, a level of intellectual engagement you rarely, if ever, experienced. It was refreshing in its way, this treatment as a thinking being, not just a physical one. He didn't offer sympathy or judgment, merely a detached analytical curiosity, and for that you were surprisingly grateful. He treated you as an equal in this strange intellectual exchange, and that was a currency far rarer than coin. When his allotted time began to draw to a close, he rose, a small, almost regretful smile playing on his lips. "I've spent more time talking than I intended," he said, though I don't regret it in the least." He placed an additional tip on the small table rather than directly into your hand, a gesture that somehow felt more respectful, less overtly transactional. "I shall return," he promised, and you knew with a quiet certainty that he would. He was in his own unique way a desirable regular not just for the money he offered, but for the unexpected balm of intellectual connection. However, a clear-eyed assessment, a self-preserving instinct you had cultivated, reminded you that it would be a mistake to read too much into it. He had paid for your time, your body, your attention, just like any other customer. That he chose to use some of that time for conversation didn't fundamentally change the nature of the transaction. The boundaries were there for a reason, a protective layer you meticulously maintained. Learning to not carry one encounter into the next, to not allow the illusion to bleed into your internal reality, was paramount. As the night wore on, the clientele grew less subtle, more overtly boisterous. Late evening often brought the group visits men celebrating, often well lubricated by drink. As the night wore on, the clientele grew less subtle, more overtly boisterous. Late evening often brought the group visits men celebrating, often well lubricated by drink, their inhibitions loosened with each passing hour. One such evening, a group of 6 men arrived from a club dinner, their boisterous laughter echoing slightly too loudly in the otherwise carefully hushed parlor. They ranged in age from their late 20s to their 50s, all in evening dress, though their slightly loosened cravats and waistcoats bearing minor stains betrayed the signs of a lengthy convivial dinner. Their voices were louder, their movements less restrained, the combined effects of good wine and male companionship making them less discreet than the afternoon's callers. Mrs. Cartwright, ever the orchestrator, navigated this delicate situation with practiced ease. She moved among them a charming, formidable presence, ensuring everyone was satisfied with the selection of young ladies presented for their consideration. It was a precise, almost choreographed process, a delicate matching of personalities and perceived desires. You were paired with Edward. He was younger, perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair receding slightly at the temples and a neat mustache that did little to hide a slightly slackened jaw. He spoke in the careful enunciation of someone monitoring their sobriety with limited success, each word pronounced with an exaggerated precision that betrayed his true state. Your professional assessment of him was swift and dispassionate. He was slightly drunk, but not incapacitated, eager, but not aggressive. You noticed the pale band on his ring finger, a subtle indentation where a wedding ring had been recently removed. Probably married, you concluded, and clearly seeking an escape from the respectable confines of his domestic life. The encounter itself was unremarkable, neither particularly pleasant nor especially difficult. He was too affected by wine to prolong matters too conventional to request anything unusual. It was a straightforward transaction, quickly and efficiently concluded. After he had, with a last mumbled thanks, drifted into a light wine-induced doze, you found yourself in a brief, odd pocket of stillness. The room was warm, almost oppressively so, the air heavy with the mingled scent of sex, his cologne, and the lingering trace of your lavender water. You lay beside him for a moment, listening to his shallow breathing, your mind detached, observing. It was during these quiet interludes that your thoughts would often drift, observing the deeper societal currents that flowed beneath the surface of these encounters. It was the hypocrisy of it all that still struck you sometimes, how the same society that condemned women like you, casting them as the ultimate symbols of female degradation, simultaneously created the very conditions that made this life necessary. It was a paradox that society studiously ignored the desperate economic plight of women with limited options, combined with the insatiable demand from the very men who upheld the moral standards that condemned you. Mr. Hamilton's detached observation that your choice was a rational economic decision resonated deeply, a rare moment of intellectual honesty in a world steeped in pretense. He understood that what was essentially a market transaction was viewed with such moral condemnation, a contradiction you knew all too well. You rose quietly, moving about the room, gathering a few stray items. Edward stirred vaguely, but did not wake fully. As he began to rouse groggy and disoriented, you performed a small final courtesy, one that was not strictly required, but was often appreciated. You helped him with his loosened cravat, your fingers deft with the familiar knot, adjusting it so he would appear more presentable as he departed. He mumbled another thanks, a genuine expression of gratitude for this small service for the larger one preceding it for the entire constructed experience that allowed him to temporarily step outside the bounds of his ordinary life. This veneer of respectability, this meticulous maintenance of appearances, was not merely a superficial overlay. It was a fundamental operating principle of the house. The parlor where you first met clients was decorated to be respectable. Yes, but with subtle hints of luxury that spoke of indulgence without being overtly vulgar. The paintings mildly suggestive but never explicit, the tasteful furniture, the discreet lighting all served to create an atmosphere of genteel discretion. This calculated decor you knew was deliberate. It maintained the veneer of respectability that protected everyone from public scrutiny, from potential police interference, from the uncomfortable reality of what was truly happening. It allowed men like Mr. Wilson to visit places like this without having to acknowledge what they were really doing, without having to confront the moral implications of their desires. It allowed everyone to participate in a carefully constructed fiction. It allowed everyone to participate in a carefully constructed fiction, a pervasive illusion that permeated every facet of your professional life. And this pretense extended beyond the confines of the brothel walls into those brief, cherished excursions into ordinary London life. You'd play the role of a respectable young woman with perfect conviction, your face serene, your eyes carefully avoiding lingering gazes, your movements graceful and unassuming. You enjoyed the freedom in this anonymity and these brief forays into a world where your true occupation was invisible. It was the simple pleasure of walking at your own pace, choosing your own direction, an unburdened liberty denied to you within the house. These small interactions with the outside world, a brief exchange with a shopkeeper, a polite nod to a passing stranger had their own peculiar pleasure, the pretense of normality, the brief, delicious escape from your actual circumstances. Yet even in these moments of fleeting freedom, you were keenly aware that the fantasy had its limits, its boundaries, both visible and invisible. There were streets you didn't walk down, entire districts you knew were off limits to women like you. The respectable tea room where ladies met their friends, their parasols neatly folded beside their chairs, was not for you. The church, with its judgmental spire reaching towards a seemingly indifferent heaven, seemed to follow you with invisible condemning eyes, its moral judgment, a constant unseen companion. You knew the weight of that judgment, the silent scarlet letter society branded upon women who made your choices, even if there was no visible sign, no tangible mark upon your person. This lack of a physical scarlet letter, this invisibility of moral judgment, sometimes brought a small wry smile to your lips, a quiet acknowledgement of society's pervasive hypocrisy. It was a profound paradox. The very society that condemned women like you as the ultimate symbols of female degradation was the same society that, through its rigid economic structures and limited opportunities, created the very conditions that made this life necessary. And then, completing the bitter cycle, it supplied the very customers who made it profitable. Mr. Hamilton's clear-eyed observation that your choice was a rational economic decision resonated deeply within you. He, unlike so many others, understood that what was essentially a market transaction was viewed with such intense moral condemnation. It was a contradiction that you and all the women in the house lived every single day. The business of the brothel, therefore, was a precise, often meticulous dance between appearance and reality, between moral condemnation and economic necessity. At the heart of it all was Mrs. Cartwright, the formidable madam. She ran a tight ship, as the saying went, expecting punctuality and presentability from her girls by noon, ready for the earliest of callers. Her rules were clear, her expectations unwavering. She insisted that the girls take scrupulous care of themselves, emphasizing that they were selling an illusion. Gentlemen, she often reminded them, didn't want to see the reality of a working woman's life. They wanted fantasy escape a perfected ideal. Her business acumen was sharp, and she understood fundamentally that healthy, presentable girls earned more money. This was why the weekly medical examinations by Dr. Harrison were non-negotiable, why good food was always provided, and why small comforts like beeswax for chapped lips were surprisingly insisted upon. It was all an investment, a strategic expenditure to maintain the quality of her commodity and, by extension, her reputation and profits. Mrs. Cartwright's personal quarters were strategically located on the ground floor, allowing her to monitor comings and goings, her ear attuned to the subtle rhythms of the house. Her presence at dinner, sitting at the head of the table in her own elegant evening dress, elevated the occasion, reinforcing the standards she expected from her girls and the clientele. Her role was complex, encompassing employer protector and disciplinarian, sometimes even a quiet mentor. There was no cruelty in her management, no unnecessary harshness, only a pragmatic distance. Her unwavering business mantra, quality of service, not quantity, is what maintains our reputation, was not just a saying, it was the foundation of her success, distinguishing her establishment from the cheaper, more desperate houses that dotted London's landscape. Her unwavering business mantra, quality of service, not quantity, is what maintains our reputation, was not just a saying, it was the foundation of her success, distinguishing her establishment from the cheaper, more desperate houses that dotted London's landscape. Supporting Mrs. Cartwright in the intricate daily operations was Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. Her face was typically set in an expression of mild disapproval, a perpetual weariness that spoke of years spent managing the less glamorous aspects of life, but you knew her to be fair in her way. Mrs. Winters was the practical backbone of the house, managing all domestic affairs, overseeing the younger maids like Betsy, and ensuring a precise, almost militaristic order in every corner. It was she who appeared, as if by magic, to escort gentlemen out discreetly, ensuring that no departing customer encountered anyone arriving a key role in maintaining the house's meticulously crafted aura of discretion. Then there was Agnes, the cook, a woman who had arrived at the house in similar circumstances to many of the girls, a widow in her 50s left destitute after her husband's death. She was a silent, almost invisible presence in the kitchen, never commenting on the nature of the business, simply cooking and keeping to herself. Her philosophy was simple and practical. Make sure the girls eat properly, she often mumbled. Good food is the foundation of health. and indeed the meals she prepared were always hearty and nourishing, a quiet testament to her belief and Mrs. Cartwright's pragmatic understanding of its value. And then there was Betsy the maid, a girl only 13 years old. She was too young for the house's main business, a fact that Mrs. Cartwright rigorously enforced. Betsy had been found begging on the street, half-starved and utterly alone, a child teetering on the brink of complete destitution. Mrs. Cartwright, in an act of what you suspected was more practicality than pure altruism, had taken her in. Betsy helped Mrs. Winters with the myriad chores, ran errands, and slept in a tiny room off the kitchen, a small, dark cubbyhole that was nonetheless warm and safe. For now she was protected, sheltered from the more brutal realities of the street. But you and all the women in the house knew the stark societal reality. In a few short years, Betsy would likely join the other girls. It was an unspoken, almost inevitable progression, a grim testament to the limited choices available to impoverished young women in this era. The economic realities were always present, a relentless undercurrent to every decision, every interaction. The contrast with other forms of female labor was stark, almost brutal. Your life as a seamstress, though respectable, meant 14 to 16 hours a day of back-breaking labor for starvation wages. You constantly battled cold hunger and the gnawing fear of the workhouse. Brothel work, by comparison, offered a shocking disparity in income. As Jane had put it so starkly, "You'd make in a night what you make in a week here, Mary." It was not a choice between good versus bad, but between different kinds of different prices to pay for survival. You had opted for the option that offered warmth food and a greater chance of continued existence, however morally condemned. Yet despite the seemingly generous income compared to other women's work, the money had a way of slipping through one's fingers. A common dream among the girls was saving enough to escape London to start fresh somewhere else, far from the suffocating judgment and the endless demands. But the money, though seemingly substantial, was consumed by a relentless tide of expenses. Lodging, food, the necessary clothes for the job, small comforts that felt like vital necessities in this demanding life. Or sometimes a friend in desperate need life you had learned had a way of consuming whatever small buffer you tried to build. The cycle of poverty was difficult to break even with the higher earnings. One was always walking a fine line, always just a few unfortunate turns away from slipping back into the abyss. Investment in appearance was not merely a vanity, it was a crucial business strategy. Mrs. Cartwright, as you knew, insisted that the girls take care of themselves because they were selling an illusion. This meant regular trips to the barber for hair styling, perhaps discreet visits to a milliner for new ribbons or a hat. The evening clothes as you donned them each night were not merely beautiful. They were a costume of sorts, a uniform for the role you played. More elaborate, more revealing, yet always tasteful. They were an investment in this profession. These garments, often expensive, were essential for attracting a better class of customer and commanding higher prices. These garments, often expensive, were essential for attracting a better class of customer and commanding higher prices. The feel of a fine cotton chemise against your skin, a world away from the rough utilitarian fabrics of your seamstress days, served as a constant, tangible reminder of this new reality. It was a reality built on illusion, a delicate and often exhausting performance that catered to the complex, often contradictory desires of the men who sought out this house. And it was in these interactions, these carefully staged encounters, that the profound hypocrisy of Victorian society was laid bare. The normality of it all, the fact that this life, this work so vehemently condemned happened right alongside ordinary London life never ceased to be a source of quiet, wry amusement. You saw the same men who would publicly decry the moral plague of prostitution discreetly knocking on Mrs. Cartwright's door after nightfall. The very society that condemned women like you, casting them as fallen angels and moral degenerates, not only created the economic conditions that made this life a necessity for so many, but also supplied the endless stream of customers who made it profitable. This hypocrisy was facilitated, even enabled, by the meticulously maintained veneer of respectability. The discreet nature of the brothel, with no obvious signs, and the parlor decorated to be respectable with hints of luxury, was a deliberate strategic choice. It maintained a thin but crucial barrier that made the unacceptable acceptable. It allowed men like Mr. Wilson, men who likely saw themselves as upstanding citizens, husbands and fathers, to visit places like this without having to acknowledge what they were really doing. It allowed them to participate in a carefully constructed fiction, a pretense of normality that shielded them from the full weight of their own contradictions. What these gentlemen truly sought, you had learned, was not simply a physical release. It was something far more ephemeral, far more complex. They wanted fantasy escape. They sought something different from their respectable wives and homes, something that made them feel special or powerful, or perhaps, most profoundly, simply seen. For some it was the thrill of the forbidden, a brief rebellion against the rigid constraints of their class and station. For others it was a search for a softness, a tenderness that was perhaps absent from their own domestic lives. And for still others, it was a desire to be listened to be admired, to have their ego stroked in a way that the world outside, with its business pressures and social obligations, rarely allowed. And you, Mary, had become exceptionally good at this work, having learned its skills as diligently as you once learned the art of sewing. Your professional persona was a masterpiece of observation and adaptation. You learned to read a man's desires in the subtle flicker of his eyes, in the tension of his shoulders, in the way he held his glass of sherry. Your voice, your posture, your conversation, all were tools you wielded with a quiet, practiced precision. You could be the demure, innocent maiden, the witty and engaging conversationalist, or the quiet, nurturing confidant, shifting between roles as the situation demanded. This was the performance, the true commodity being sold far more valuable than the physical act itself. It was this performance that allowed for the negotiation unspoken but clear of what would and would not happen during an encounter. A certain turn of phrase, a specific glance, a gentle redirection of conversation, all were part of a subtle language that established boundaries and expectations without ever needing to be stated aloud. Even a seemingly genuine encounter like the one with Mr. Hamilton was still at its core a transaction. His additional tip, placed so respectfully on the table, was for the conversation as much as anything else. It was a recognition of your skill, of the specific fantasy you had provided for him, but it was payment nonetheless. Your clear-eyed assessment after he left was a necessary act of self-preservation. It would be a mistake to read too much into it. He paid for your time, your body, and your attention, just like any other customer. That he chose to use some of that time for conversation did not fundamentally change the nature of the transaction. It was a crucial distinction, a mental line you drew in the sand to protect the core of your own self. It was a crucial distinction, a mental line you drew in the sand to protect the core of your own self. This professional persona, this carefully constructed performance, was a shield, allowing you to maintain a necessary distance. Your professional self was attentive, charming, apparently delighted by each man's company, regardless of the reality. This performance, however, was not simply a mask. It was a complex skill, a form of emotional labor that was as demanding as any physical toil. And so, night after night, you performed this delicate dance. After the boisterous groups of men had departed, after the last late-night caller had been discreetly seen out, a quiet, almost melancholic peace would settle over the house. This was often the time when you and the other girls would gather in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, for a late supper. The conversation was usually desultory, relaxed, a gentle unwinding after the demands of the evening. There was a profound comfort in this shared understanding, this common experience that needed no explanation or justification. You could speak freely here, sharing observations about the night's customers, exchanging small pieces of gossip, or simply sitting in companionable silence, a quiet solidarity that was a balm to the soul. It was in these quiet moments, or later in the sanctuary of your shared room with Lily, that the deeper questions of your life would surface. Lily, younger, and perhaps still more idealistic than you, would sometimes ask, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. Do you ever wonder what it would be like? A different life? It was a question that hung in the air, filled with a poignant blend of hope and resignation. And your response, born of bitter experience, was always pragmatic, always grounded in the harsh realities you had known. But then I remember what it was actually like. You would say, your voice low and steady, the hunger, the cold, the constant fear of ending up in the workhouse. At least here we eat well, we're warm, we have some control over our lives. It was a stark, unromantic assessment, but one that held a profound truth. It was not a choice between good versus bad, but between different kinds of difficult, different prices to pay. You had chosen the path that for now at least offered a greater degree of comfort and security, however precarious. This was the lived reality of your choice in a constrained world. The brothel, for all its moral complexities and social condemnation, offered a strange, inverted kind of freedom. It was a place where, paradoxically, you had a degree of economic independence, however limited. You earned your own money, managed your own small finances, and were not dependent on a husband or a factory owner for your survival. There was a fierce, if often complicated, female solidarity, a sense of shared struggle that created bonds of loyalty and support. And within the confines of the house, you had a degree of control over your daily existence, however constrained by the larger social forces that shaped your world. These small freedoms, these brief escapes into normalcy, were precious, cherished moments. The anonymity of walking the streets on an errand, the simple pleasure of a jam tart bought with your own money, the quiet camaraderie of the late-night kitchen. These were the small anchors that kept you grounded, that helped you maintain a sense of self amidst the relentless demands of your profession. As you lay in your bed, listening to the quiet breathing of Lily beside you, the distant sounds of London's late-night activity, a muffled hum, a kind of wisdom would sometimes emerge, a perspective that saw beyond the daily struggles. Your life in this Victorian brothel, you realized, was just one tiny thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of women's experiences throughout history. It was a difficult life. Yes, dangerous in its own way, morally condemned by the very society that simultaneously created the conditions that made it necessary and the demand that made it profitable. But it was also, in its own paradoxical way, a place of certain freedoms unavailable elsewhere. It was a space where women, stripped of the protections of respectable society, created their own rules, their own systems of support, their own ways of navigating a hostile world. It was a life of profound contradictions, a constant dance between illusion and reality, between performance and self. And as you drifted towards the edge of sleep, the weight of history of all the women who came before you, finding their own complex paths through similarly constrained choices, felt momentarily present. Not as a burden, but as a kind of company, a silent chorus of shared experience echoing through the centuries. You were not the first to navigate these waters, and you would certainly not be the last. The particulars would change the fashions, the specific economics, the exact social structures, but some essential quality of the experience, some fundamental aspect of the struggle and the survival would remain constant across time. And in this quiet, almost mystical understanding there was a strange, profound comfort. And in this quiet, almost mystical understanding there was a strange, profound comfort. The sounds of the city began to fade, the clip-clop of a late-night carriage, the distant call of a watchman, all dissolving into the soft, enveloping silence of your room. Here, in the familiar simplicity of the space you shared with Lily, the layers of performance could finally be shed completely. Here no customers ever came, no pretense was required. This was your sanctuary, a purely private space, the one place in the entire sprawling, judgmental city that belonged just to you and your roommate. It was here in the quiet threshold between waking and sleeping that the day's events could finally be processed, filed away, and released. Your private bedroom was a world away from the opulent, carefully staged parlors downstairs. It was small, almost Spartan, with 2 simple iron bedsteads, a single shared washstand, and a small, scarred wooden wardrobe. A few personal items offered a touch of individuality. A well-worn copy of a novel on your bedside table, a small, faded tintype of your parents tucked away in a drawer, a few colorful ribbons that Lily had bought at a market. These small personal treasures were anchors to a self that existed beyond the confines of the brothel, a quiet testament to a life lived before, and perhaps a hint of a life yet to come. As you lay there, the day's encounters would often replay themselves in your mind, not as vivid emotional memories, but as a series of detached observations. You'd think of Mr. Wilson, his quiet awkwardness, his almost desperate search for a gentle, uncomplicated kindness. You'd think of Mr. Hamilton, his intellectual curiosity, the surprising, almost exhilarating experience of being treated as a thinking being. And you'd think of Edward, the conventionally drunk gentleman, his encounter a brief, unremarkable blip in the landscape of the evening. Each man in his own way represented a different facet of the male desire that fueled this industry, a different kind of need that society in its rigid structures could not or would not fulfill. You learned over time to not carry one encounter into the next, to not let the emotions real or feigned of one interaction bleed into another. This protective boundary, this mental compartmentalization was a vital skill, one that helped preserve a core of self amid the incessant demands of the work. You had seen other girls fail to maintain this distance, girls who became too attached to a particular client, or who let the harsh words or rough treatment of another break their spirit. They rarely lasted long. Survival in this world required a certain emotional resilience, a quiet, steely core that could bend without breaking. Your relationship with Lily was a crucial part of this survival. The shared dream of escaping to the seaside was a powerful, if often distant, motivator. You would talk for hours about it, painting vivid pictures of a small cottage, the smell of the salt air, the freedom of walking on the beach with no one to judge you. It was a shared fantasy, a story you told each other to keep hope alive, a quiet rebellion against the seeming permanence of your current situation. But beneath the fantasy, there was a deep, practical solidarity. You looked out for each other, sharing tips, warnings, and small kindnesses. If one of you was feeling unwell, the other would cover for her making excuses to Mrs. Cartwright. If one of you had a particularly difficult client, the other would be there afterwards with a sympathetic ear and a shared cup of tea. This camaraderie was not just a comfort, it was a lifeline. In a world where you were so often seen as objects, as commodities, your friendship was a powerful affirmation of your shared humanity. As sleep finally began to claim you, the boundaries between thought and dream would blur. The faces of the day's clients would fade, replaced by more abstract, universal images. The weight of history of all the women who had walked this path before you in different cities in different centuries would feel palpably present. You were part of a long, unbroken chain, a lineage of women who had used their bodies to survive in a world that offered them few other options. The particulars of your life. The Victorian fashions, the specific economic pressures of 19th century London were just a temporary costume for a timeless drama. The fundamental human needs for warmth, for food, for safety, for a moment of human connection transcended history. And in that final moment before consciousness slipped away completely, there was just the simple reality of a human body needing rest, a mind seeking the quiet renewal of sleep. These were the most basic requirements of existence, unchanged since the beginning of humanity, a universal truth that connected you in your small shadowed room to the vast, sprawling tapestry of human experience. And in that there was a final profound peace. And so, as the profound peace of sleep settles over Mary in her small shadowed room, let that same sense of quiet and release begin to settle over you. The bustling gas-lit streets of Victorian London begin to fade, the sounds of horse-drawn carriages and distant voices dissolving into the silence of your own comfortable space. The anxieties and calculations of her world, the constant performance and the quiet moments of stolen peace all begin to recede, becoming a distant, fading echo in the vastness of history. Think of the contrast between her reality and yours. Feel the steady, even support of your own bed, a world away from her lumpy horsehair mattress. Appreciate the gentle warmth that surrounds you, a simple, constant comfort. She could only dream of a stark contrast to the rationed coal and the biting chill of a London morning. The air you breathe is clean, free from the pervasive soot and the miasma of the 19th century city. There are no demands on you now, no performance required, no need to guard your thoughts or your heart. You are safe, you are warm, and you are free to simply let go. Allow the gentle rhythm of your own breathing to be your guide. Now a slow, steady tide drawing you further and further away from the waking world. Let each breath be an act of release, letting go of the day's thoughts, the day's worries, the echoes of a story from a time long past. There is nothing left to do now, nothing to solve, nothing to understand. There is only the soft, inviting stillness of the present moment, a quiet harbor of peace and tranquility. The story has been told, the journey is complete, and all that remains is the gentle, inevitable drift into a deep and restorative sleep.